Sherritt, CF Sherritt. Oh my gosh, that's so embarrassing. Somebody share it.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Poetology. This video is an interview with the poet Betsy Porritt about her pamphlet Oh Unquenchable Thirst. We discuss how she transitioned from this first pamphlet to her second pamphlet. We talk about poetry and place, tone and voice, and how it is to work with a small publisher. I hope you enjoy this interview, and I'll see you on the other side. Hi Betsy.
Hi Dan, nice to see you.
Nice to see you today. Thanks for coming to Poetology for this interview.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I feel very honoured and humbled and proud to have a friend like you.
Oh, that's so sweet, Betsy. Well, I'm very happy to talk about your poetry, and we're going to talk about your second pamphlet, Oh Unquenchable Thirst. Your first one was A Mediated and Partial Zone, which I have here too. Before we start, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everybody. I am Betsy Porritt and I write poems. I'm a sort of practice-based academic. I teach at the University of Birmingham. I live in the West Midlands. I actually live a literal stone's throw from the Midlands oak, which is apparently an oak tree that marks the centre of England, which is sort of exciting. And I sort of forgot to prepare my introduction properly. But yeah, I write poems, I read poems. I'm lucky enough to be employed at the University of Birmingham, and I have these two little poetry books. I'm from Devon originally.
As I said, we're going to talk about this pamphlet today, but I was interested in how you moved from the project that informed the first pamphlet to writing the second pamphlet.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Dan, because I think it was actually really, really nice to get to kind of look back at that little journey, and because they are quite different in lots of ways. And A Mediated and Partial Zone was written in a really, so it's there's one sort of shortish poem at the beginning, or 1-2 page poem at the beginning, and then this like long sequence of 5-line poems. And this long sequence was written really, I had quite sort of structured rules, and it's really about sort of choosing a word and unpicking that word and making a kind of an interconnected series of poems. There's loads of like very specific weird little rules that I set myself, and I was really playing with kind of constraint and rule that aren't at all obvious necessarily to the reader, but that helped me kind of like write this long sequence. And I wanted to write a kind of long sequence of small fragments. But it's funny because the last poem in it, the last little 5 lines, when I looked back at it, it really kind of steps across to the beginning of Oh Unquenchable Thirst. So even though they were published a few years apart, and A Mediated and Partial Zone, I was writing when I was writing my PhD. I was thinking a lot about kind of academic ways of thinking about poetry and folding in a lot of my kind of academic writing and thinking. Actually, Oh Unquenchable Thirst is much more kind of about feeling and about trying to communicate something a bit more clearly and just sort of like follow my nose, and there are hardly any kind of rules and structures in it. But the end of A Mediated and Partial Zone and the beginning of Oh Unquenchable Thirst definitely have a little connection. So yeah.
What inspired you then to write Oh Unquenchable Thirst? What was on your mind when you started writing the pamphlet?
Yeah, so I think I am a bit of an assembler. I don't know if I tend to not think I'm going to write a poem about this, but I'm a real kind of assembler of things. I think I remember the poet Dorothy Lahan saying something similar, that it takes her a while to actually write a poem because she just sort of like gathers things together. And once she was talking about writing a lyric journal, and just, I keep like notebooks where I just observe things and then just write down little collections of stuff. And when they start to speak to one another, or there start to be sort of similar lines across, or little echoes and little lines of communication, then a poem kind of emerges. That's how so much of Oh Unquenchable Thirst was written. There are a few different parts, like there's a long sequence in it called Experiments, where I have this sort of repeated form. And the phrase is, I took my shoes off. And it's just lots and lots of sort of instances where I might or might not have taken off my shoes, kind of repeated over again. But the majority of it is really, rather than with a mediated impartial zone, which was very kind of like, okay, I'm going to follow a system. Actually, Oh Unquenchable Thirst, I was like, I want to get back into writing that is about how I'm sort of feeling and experiencing the world. And I mean, it's clear, Oh Unquenchable Thirst was written after the pandemic. My dad died. I'd finished my PhD. A lot of like big things had happened. I needed to kind of get back in touch with just how I feel and see and experience the world. And that's how it sort of came to it, I guess.
When I read the pamphlet, it looked to me like it was very anchored in place, and a lot of poems refer to the seaside. Is this something that was conscious on your part, or something that happened as you were writing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Devon and I was born in the English Riviera. I don't know if anyone knows the English Riviera is Torbay, just exactly like the French Riviera. Like, you could be in Nice, you could be in Paynton, like it's just the same. But I've always kind of loved British seaside spaces. I lived in Margate for a little while and I did my PhD in Canterbury. So sort of these funny, extremely beautiful, like difficult, faded, strange places just come up against so many contradictions. And I think one of the things that I wanted to think about with Oh Unquenchable Thirst that was different from the first pamphlet was I really wanted to make things specific and place and have some sort of anchoring things that a reader might be able to, the poems themselves are a little amorphous and strange, and there's lots in there that is there for the kind of the reader to sort of just feel and experience and not necessarily to extrapolate super strong meaning from. But I did try to kind of actually name places and name locations as well, so that that could be a kind of anchor. Okay, I don't really know what else this poem is doing, but it's talking about the A2 on the way to Dover. Like, then what does that make us think about the A2 on the way to Dover? And someone considering the A2 on the way to Dover might not have the same feelings, but it's sort of trying to capture a particular moment way that I was thinking about the A2 on the way to Dover and all the other things that were kind of coming into that. So yeah, there are things in poems, the poems that I like to read the most play with the sort of fluid relationship between the specific and the abstract, and don't try to kind of tell me exactly, a story that's like super, super clear, but do give me a few, like a real thing for you to hold. And whilst you're holding that, like hear all this other stuff going around it. And how does it make you consider that real thing differently, or just what does it make you think?
Yeah, it's a really good way of describing what you're doing, actually. Yeah. And so there are the specific things, and then there's the abstract, and the abstract parts sometimes read like a commentary, slightly political commentary, maybe even with like philosophical elements. Part of it is also the tone you use that is kind of full of amusement and wonder, but also acutely attentive to some details. What do you want the tone of your poems to convey?
Mm. And tone is so funny, isn't it? Like, is tone similar to voice?
Yeah.
Tone and voice are a bit separate, aren't they?
Slightly separate. I'd say the tone is slightly more specific. It's part of the voice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. It's complex to answer it. I would say tone is one aspect of the voice.
Maybe like tone is like perspective, and maybe that's connected to sort of specificness. I'm not just trying to say the A2 to Dover exists. I don't know why I keep on going back to the A2 to Dover, which is in the poems, by the way. But read to find out. I'm not just saying, oh, the A2 to Dover exists. I suppose the tone is like, it exists, and here is what I want to kind of tell you I feel about it, or here is how I'm feeling about it, or how I'm thinking about it. And I think none of us can escape a politics, even if we do not think of ourselves as political. That is a politics in itself. None of us can escape a philosophy. We think about things, we come to conclusions about things, we ask questions of things, even if we don't know, and we make judgments about things, even if we're not aware that what we're doing is judging something. So maybe part of what my poetry practice does for me is kind of reveal to me what is my philosophy or my approach to something, and how do I understand that. If I look at the A2 to Dover, do I notice, like a feat of, human engineering? Do I notice like a throughway to Europe that is like contested ground? Do I notice the historic road that was actually underneath from like ancient Roman times? Do I notice all the destruction of the natural world that it has created? Do I notice the jobs of the people who like drive on it and maintain it and live by it? And I just think it's really important that there are like some poems that say, here is a thing that we should all be thinking. Here's like a specific politics, like here is our like manifesto. But I think that there's a politics to saying we can look at anything from multiple perspectives, but this is the way I want us to think about it, just within the space of these lines. So maybe that's the tone. I mean, sometimes, you want to make like a declaration and be didactic and like tell the reader this is the thing. But I suppose my tone, what I would like to do is just to get people to understand you can see anything in multiple ways. And like, here's one theory for how we might do that.
So let's talk about form then. How do you settle on the different forms? Because as you said, your first pamphlet had a very specific, very set form with short stanzas, like 5-line stanzas on each page. Whereas Oh Unquenchable Thirst varies quite a lot. For example, I was struck by this one that is in a column. The lines are even shorter than Eileen Miles's poems. And then others take up more space, and the last one is almost more like a prose poem. So yeah, how do you settle on form?
I mean, it's fun to like use all the tools in the toolbox, isn't it? All the tools of sound, like alliteration and rhyme and rhythm. But it's fun to use all the visual tools as well. And actually, I'm glad you've given me a lovely opportunity, because if anyone out there does in fact have this, I would love to draw your attention to one of the poems from the little mini sequence called Harbingers on page 20. And I was so proud of myself that there's so much weird little rhyme in here. And I really used the kind of form of where the line breaks fell to make these rhymes. So there's a little sequence of weird half rhymes that all the lines end in the, via, wafer, the, sea. And it's just I really enjoyed kind of, sometimes the form is dictated by the line break, where I actually wanted the line to end. And some of it is about pace and tempo. I was thinking a lot about sound poetry and music and sound as I was writing it, and the tools of music and sound. So much of that is about tempo, like speeding things up, slowing things down. And that very thin column, that Mork song poem, song is in the word, it's actually really fast when you read it aloud. It has a real kind of pace to it. And then there's longer lines, it really like slows things down. And then I had got a bit anxious about form as well, and a bit anxious about, have I just written some poems that are just these like, they don't have like a sort of a theory for how they should appear, like, especially so Big Round Grief-Stricken Mackerel Sky, which kind of has these uneven stanza shapes. And when I finished it, or when I sort of felt it was kind of finished, I was like, there's 2 lines, and then the next stanza is 6 lines, and then the next one is 3 lines. And it was just very intuitive. And I was a bit like, I didn't really think about it. So then does that mean that it's bad, or it's unfinished, or like sloppy? So I put it into, 3-line stanzas and experimented with, making it much more formal. And then just felt very like stiff and fake and forced. And I was like, well, that's just how it fell out. Like 2 lines and then a bit of a breath, and then a sort of 6-line longer bit and a bit of a breath. And just, I think, actually learning to reject form a little bit and just trust my instinct, that was also really like important. I'm sure that poets, no matter how old you are, like when you like write poems when you're like 50, 60, 70, you still have that, I should be writing, I should write in a form and, put it in conversation with like sonnets from times beyond. But actually, you can also just write things intuitively and take a break and use the page as you want. Yeah. Do you have
Great advice.
anxiety about using forms?
Yeah, I have. I often feel like I should push myself to use new forms,
Yeah.
even when it's kind of artificial. And then I'm like, well, I don't need to do this just because other poets do it. But sometimes you feel like you need to like show off that you can do,
Yeah.
all the forms.
And
Yeah.
and sometimes like, yeah, like I think everyone tries to write a villanelle, right? And everyone has their sonnet era, and everyone like goes through it. And I loved writing my own form for mediation partial zone, just coming up with these completely random rules that were only meaningful to me. I wasn't speaking to anyone else's form. I was just speaking, And then that was really useful. But it felt really nice just to be like, oh, you also don't always have to have a plan. You don't have to have a plan. And it still has meaning and value, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is it like to work with small presses, and how did you approach them?
Oh, I'm so thankful for, all the people who build and make community. And like with Guillemot Press, so this was with Guillemot, and that's Luke Thompson and Sarah Cave. And I had this sort of manuscript of poems, and I just sent it in. I don't think they even had an open reading. I had something, and I was like, I think it's sort of in shareable form, and I sent it out to loads of different places, like Sallow Press, Guillemot Press, I think like Bad Betty, Broken Sleep, quite a few of the sort of small presses. And I was just lucky that I think Sarah read it and just really liked it. Something about it she picked up on. And then I had this amazing back and forth with Luke, and Luke involved the artist RF Sherritt, CF Sherritt. Oh my gosh, that's so embarrassing. Somebody Sherritt, who did this great, like, weird little illustration on the front, and my like little goon on the back as well. And Guillemot Press takes just such care. They make books that like have a lot of care, but they're not overly precious either. They're accessible books, and he practices very good politics of working with like super local people or sustainable product, brings in the authors really, really well. And like asked my advice and like checked with me on loads of different things. We had like lots of nice back and forth. And actually, I feel like it's lovely to have that kind of input. But also, when I handed over the manuscript, I was really like, oh, now it's sort of a collaborative thing. It's kind of beyond me. And that's actually also really nice to like just let go and be like, I probably would never have chosen a purple cover, but but actually like that's their decision, and then that also feels really nice to kind of have someone else be like, oh yes, this is this to us seems like the right thing for the poems. And that's just kind of nice to sort of like lose control a little bit. And, yeah. And then Luke Roberts and Amy, who do Distance No Object and publish really amazing stuff. I was invited to a reading in London, and I had the kind of collection in a sort of a form. And this is actually my like hot tip to anyone, is if you're ever invited to a reading, or you're even going to a reading, if you can print off like a little small version of your poems, make it into a little homemade chapbook, and take a couple of copies and just give them to people. Anyone who comes up to you and says, oh, I really like that, just give it away. Because it's exactly what I've done in almost this form. And I had like a little illustration on the front, and I sort of just made like a little homemade chapbook, just sort of printed it off and folded it up, and I just handed one to Luke. I was like, oh, if you like that, please feel free to take this and read it. And he sent me a really sweet email a little while later saying, this is great, like, can Distance No Object put it out? And that was, also really nice. And Luke is also very generous. I got sent like a bunch of copies when they were published. I haven't been paid for any of that work, but I also haven't paid them, all the kind of cost of producing the books and marketing it and sending it out and stuff is there. So, profits maybe are being made somewhere, but it's important to me to not need to make money off my poetry, but recognize that it is work and there's labor involved in it as well. Like I find that this is an interesting place, and I'm like privileged because I have a full-time job. I can just write poems and I don't need to sell them. So I think small presses and the industry of small presses, they do it because they love it, but they don't just do it because they love it, and like they put in so much work. How can we make that sustainable without it only being the privilege of like people who have academic jobs or things like that? That's a question I'm still kind of turning around. Like, how can we support more like small presses that aren't in this right now? It's so difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Thank you. Could you please read us a poem of your choice?
Yes.
Yes.
So I thought I might read. There's quite a lot of like grief and anger and things in some of these poems, but I thought maybe I would read Mork's Song, which is this sort of long, thin one, because it's got loads in it, but actually it is like really, really full of love, and maybe like asks some of these questions. and puts into conversation like some very specific places. It starts in like the muddy creek in Devon, right next to where I grew up, and it sort of traverses lots of different places. Mork song. When I say creek, what I mean is rut, burdensome old mud, impossibly white egrets, ground making, rutted railroad rhythms, shiver driven by swallow dives, this hairline fracture, that unquenchable thirst. The other nature I want is what happened down there to my dad's rubber soles, twixt ungovernable worms, tween profitable wheat. Today I notice Birmingham is estuarine, greedy, longing queries, but what bird wilt thou employ to bring me word of thee? Back on the horse that threw me, Jerome at the frick, I know his fingernail dirt is paint, but still, a marble in a shell is precarious, a wheat field against Wall Street. We are all lying in wait along the back roads, backed right up to the main road, maximum fragility against maximum power, a problem of liquidity, bargains and blow-ins, whipped up consistency, iced pink shadow city, fingers, blowouts, cop-outs, and clip-clop to the shop shouts. They know we've had a long Tory spell. Miraculous transformation is possible after all. Wine to yolky piss, time a puckered face. Sloppy dog says, wash up on our shores. He's checking the teeth of his magnificent horses, begging for what is solvable twixt my desire for a strawberry in November, between the playground on the A2 to Dover.
Thank you. I love that poem.
Thank you so much, Dan.
And we finally see where the A2 to Dover comes in.
Exactly. I thought, as I've mentioned it so much.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for this interview, Betsy, and for taking the time to talk about your pamphlet. I will put the link to buy the pamphlet and your personal links to social media and everything below.
Thank you. And I want to say, for anyone who's made it this long and has any questions or wants to follow up or wants to talk about poetry or any kind of poetry chat, please do reach out. I'm on Instagram and Twitter.
I hope you enjoyed hearing Betsy talking about her pamphlet. You will find all of her information below, including where to buy a copy of Oh Unquenchable Thirst. Let us know in the comments if you liked any particular aspect of this conversation. I look forward to seeing you in the next video very soon. Bye!